abbiamo molto a cuore sia gli autori sia i lettori e ci piace inventare sempre dei nuovi modi per portare delle grandi storie a tutti coloro che possano apprezzarle. Quindi ci piace trovare sempre nuovi modi per mettere in comunicazione gli autori, che sono la fonte delle storie importanti, con i lettori e coloro che appunto ne possano fruire. E proprio in questo contesto sono molto felice di presentarvi Claire Prentice. Claire Prentice è una giornalista che annovera tra le sue collaborazioni testate come la BBC, Washington Post, Huffington Post, The Times of London e molti altri. Ed è anche autrice, infatti ha scritto un libro con Amazon Publishing che è The Tribe of Coney Island, The Lost Tribe of Coney Island, e pubblicato come Kindle single invece The Miracle of Coney Island. Nelle sue ricerche, sono 2 libri non fiction, nelle sue ricerche lei è venuta a conoscenza, ha scoperto, poi ce lo racconterà, che insomma le fake news non sono proprio una novità. Quindi io non voglio rubare ulteriore tempo, lascio la parola a Claire Prentice che ci racconterà appunto la sua esperienza e che cosa ha scoperto. Buon divertimento.
Okay, well, it's great to be here, and thanks for all coming out. So I'm here to talk about fake news in a historical context, and my own take on fake news has very much been shaped by writing The Lost Tribe of Coney Island and Miracle at Coney Island, which are both non-fiction stories, historical stories that take place from the 1890s forward. Now, the role of the news we consume has been very much part of the news recently, following Brexit in my country, the United Kingdom, and the election of Donald Trump. But 2016 didn't mark the first time that public opinion was swayed by an aggressively partisan media. I think much of our debate about fake news, I would argue, is too ahistorical. We talk about fake news as though it's brand new, as though it's come from nowhere, as though it's without precedent, and as though it marks a low point in the history of the media. Now, I would argue that fake news has been part of the media landscape for as long as there has been journalism. There have always been people who have distorted the news, who've spun it, who've fabricated stories to further a particular political viewpoint or for financial gain. In Britain, we saw examples of it in the propaganda sheets of the 18th century. In America, it reached a particular fever pitch, if you like, in the 1890s when the term yellow journalism was first coined. And I think, though we're concerned about fake news in a new medium, online, I don't think we can necessarily say that there's more fake news around as a percentage or that it's more influential than it was in the past. My story, so it takes place in the aftermath of this 1898 Spanish-American War. And the Spanish-American War was a war in which journalism was hugely influential. We saw the media of the 1890s manipulating public opinion to get America into the war. There were stories about fictionalizing the circumstances around the sinking of the USS Maine, which was a key event in the run-up to the war, which was blamed by journalists without any evidence whatsoever on Spain. And the journalists of the past were often happy to admit printing fake news. So we saw William Randolph Hearst, who had the very influential New York Journal, in a week after hostilities broke out with Spain, his front page in the New York Journal asked, "How do you like the Journal's war?" It was a very clear declaration that a newspaper had had a hand in the events running up to that war. Now, in researching this book and my Kindle single, I read thousands of newspaper articles from across America and beyond. And I discovered numerous examples of what today we would call fake news. Obviously, the term fake news is a new term, but the phenomena is far from it. And they broke down into 2 broad categories, which sometimes overlapped. So firstly, there were inaccuracies, there were lies, there were assertions which clearly hadn't been fact-checked, and there were articles which were sensationalized to sell newspapers. We also saw articles fabricated to give weight to a particular political viewpoint. And 120 years ago, the time around when my book was set, fake news was seen as having reached fever pitch. Newspapers were out of control, something had to be done to bring them in line. It was seen as threatening the kind of trust on which the shared discourse of democracy depends. And then the drivers of fake news were, as they are today, partisan politics and intense competition between the media. So the two most influential papers in the 1890s that were driving this, it was the competition between Joseph Pulitzer and William Randolph Hearst, between the New York World and his New York Journal. So I think there's an interesting irony there that today we think of Pulitzer and we associate his name with this prize that rewards outstanding journalism, where in fact his newspaper was leading this kind of race to the bottom, if you like, debasing journalism in the push for readers. A little bit like Alfred Nobel, who invents dynamite and then bequeaths his money to set up a peace prize. And I think it's really interesting to note as well that, there was a recognition at the time that this was very damaging to the profession. So, an epidemic that threatened to take over the free press. We had a meeting of prominent journalists in the late 19th century at which a respected newspaper editor, Loretus Metcalfe, said that due to the intense competition between Hearst and his journal, Pulitzer and the New York World, quote, the evil grew until publishers all over the country began to think that perhaps at heart the public really might prefer vulgarity. Now, the Lost Tribe of Coney Island, this takes place, I've said, in the aftermath of the Spanish-American War. And after its defeat in the war, Spain ceded its long-standing colony of the Philippines to America. And my book tells the story, the true story, of a group of 51 men, women, and children from a tribe called, they were Bontoc Igorots, who were taken from their remote mountainous home to America by a man called Truman Hunt, who was a former American government employee. He was given permission by the American government to take these 51 people to America, where he took them to Coney Island in New York and put them on show. So they were they were an early human zoo, what we would now call a human zoo. So at Coney Island, they put on this, it was a distorted kind of show of their cultures, their customs. And the public turned out, hundreds of thousands of members of the public turned out. They were also visited by the daughter of the president, so Alice Roosevelt came to see them, anthropologists came to see them, Broadway stars came to see them to see if they could have potential to be the subject of a new show. And importantly, they were visited by thousands of journalists there was journalists there pretty much every day. There was a media agent who was putting out stories, and Truman Hunt, the Igorots' manager, was himself very adept at spinning a story. He was a kind of, you might characterize him as a kind of early spin doctor. He was great at coming up with stories, and he had the contacts to get those stories out. And they were they had been promised a salary to come, so they'd been told that they would be paid a certain amount of money. And in return, they had to do this show, which they weren't always happy with. So in my research, I read millions of words about the Igorots and about their performance in America. And the vast majority of what I read was not true. It became obvious to me in reading and researching this article that I had to be very, very skeptical about what I was reading. They were described as headhunting, dog-eating savages and the most primitive people in the world. Now, it was true they did in the Philippines hunt heads. It was something they didn't do all that often, but it was part of their culture, and they did eat dog. However, when they were in America, the press became obsessed with this idea. All they wanted to report on was dog eating and headhunting. And it's important to note this plays into a political narrative. It was in the interests of the American government, who had given Truman Hunt permission to exhibit these tribespeople, that the Igorots were portrayed as savages, that these aspects of their culture were kind of twisted and exaggerated, so that this was how they came to be defined. And there were numerous examples I came across. So the headline in one paper was "Chain Up Your Dogs," "Lock Up Fido," and these kind of stories they were endless. They were repeated over and over and over again. The New York Tribune, which interestingly had been established in 1841 with the goal of providing a trustworthy source of news at a time when sensationalism was seen as having become such a feature of the media. Despite these noble intentions, even the Tribune couldn't resist reporting on the Igorots in a way which was fabricated. On May 26, 1905, the Tribune described how the police came to the Igorot village to investigate a woman named Mrs. Jackman's claims that the Igorots had stolen her dog, Prince, and eaten him. In fact, Mrs. Jackson was a neighbour of Truman Hunt's, the Igorots manager, and she was acting a part, basically to help out her friend to publicise his show. The tribespeople, as I've mentioned, in the Philippines, they did eat dog. It was something they ate very occasionally. So if there was a wedding, it was part of their feast. In America, they were given it every day. So it was a part of their show, which the public flocked to see. And in fact, in reading other documents from more trustworthy sources, the Igorots had actually complained to their manager. They'd said, this dog meat's making us sick, it's so rich, we don't want to be given it every day. To which they were told, well, it's the most popular feature of the show, so you're going to have it every day, whether you like it or not. On July 19th, 1905, the New York Morning Telegraph ran an article with the headline, "Igorots and Whites in Battle." And it described how the Igorots, again, it was taking up the dog meat theme. They were so hungry for dog meat that they broke into a neighbouring circus tent in the dead of night and stole 3 fox terriers and a Russian wolfhound. When their crime was discovered, the Igorots reportedly grabbed their spears and engaged in a fierce battle with 40 of their white Coney Island neighbours. Other articles described how they had to be restrained to prevent them from practicing their headhunting ritual in America. And in fact, as you might have surmised, none of these stories are true. They were invented to emphasize how primitive the Igorots were with their headhunting, dog-eating customs. Now, the fabricated articles benefited 3 parties. So they're benefiting their manager, because obviously he's getting rich. The newspaper journalists are helping to sell more newspapers. And they're also serving a wider political agenda, because the US presence in the Philippines had caused deep divisions in American society. There was a very significant portion of the public who were opposed to war, who didn't think America should be in the Philippines, and who were strongly opposed to the idea of American expansionism. The American government, of all the tribes that could have been brought to America, because in the Philippines there were many, many, many different tribes, it's significant that permission was given to bring a group of tribespeople who had customs that could be twisted and distorted to be presented as savages. The government has this message that here are these people, look at their customs, they need to be civilized, they need to be educated, they need us to be in their country to show them how they can lead a good and civilized life. And when they learn that lesson, we will allow them to govern themselves, was the message. They were described as if they were a kind of civics class. They were presented in a popular image of the time, they were presented as Uncle Sam's infant class. On July 7th, 2005, the New York Tribune reported that when it came time to elect their new leader, Truman Hunt persuaded the tribespeople to put down their arms, and instead of fighting to find the toughest member of the tribe who could then become the new chief, they were persuaded to adopt the American custom and to cast votes at the ballot box. There's a very clear message there. It was colourful, it was guaranteed to fascinate the American reader, and it was also nonsense. interestingly, support for the tribespeople, there were journalists who had supported them, sometimes came from unexpected quarters. So in the August 2005 issue of Vogue, a journalist defends the tribe's right to eat dog and says, what difference ultimately is there between that and the American taste for beef? Which seems to me a good point. There's an interesting modern parallel. Only last month we had Teen Vogue running an op-ed criticising Donald Trump for gaslighting America. In it, Lauren Ducka, the journalist, wrote, "Trump's rise to power has awakened a force of bigotry by condoning and encouraging hatred, but also by normalising deception." Now, the Igorots reached Coney Island after travelling across the continental United States. They started off in Seattle, and then they went to New York via Chicago. And after they left Coney Island, they went on to exhibit in 50 towns and cities across America and in Canada. And I looked at newspapers in all the towns and cities they visited, and they all repeat the same stories, and they often use identical language. Obviously, this is in a time before the internet. I think Truman Hunt was feeding them these stories, and also the journalists were very happy to take these stories because they were going to sell papers. A lot of the coverage was racist, it was patronising, facts were invented about their customs and turned into comic stories. There were lots of racist stereotypes. The Chicago Daily News published a cartoonish picture which presented the Igorots as wild men and women. They had these wide staring eyes, unruly hair, huge hoop earrings, nearly naked bodies. As a tribe in the Philippines, they didn't wear very much clothing. This was seized on as a fascinating fact for newspaper consumers. And interestingly, at the same time that they were being presented in this way, the newspapers had regular reports on the political situation in the Philippines. So I think at the time, the journalists might have dismissed it as, oh, this is a bit of fun, blah, blah, blah. I think taking it from a historical perspective, there's headlines I came across, such as one in the Tribune, "Filipinos not fit to rule." And it's an article which sums up the view of the American Secretary of War at the time, William Howard Taft, who was traveling with a group of congressmen in Manila. And the quote from the article, "The Filipinos are altogether unfit for immediate independence, due, among other things, to the problems presented in the civilization of the Igorots, Moros, Maccabees, and other tribes." And as I say, a century on, it's very clear to see that all the fabricated articles about dog eating, about headhunting, about how they're in Coney Island wearing hardly any clothes, they are very clearly playing into a wider political agenda here. Now, moving on to my second work, it was while researching the Lost Tribe of Coney Island that I chanced upon a mention of Martin Cooney, the incubator doctor. And he, from 1903 to 1943, ran an infant incubator exhibit at Coney Island. And his true story became the subject of my second work. And Cooney, it's interesting, at the time, American hospitals, as in many other countries, didn't have incubators for premature babies. Premature babies were thought of as weaklings who should be left, their fate should be left, their survival should be left to fate. If they thrived, fair enough. If they didn't, well, possibly they're just going to become a drain on society, was the view that was taken of them. Whereas Cooney thought, we can do something for these babies. He had incubators, he put them on show, and the public paid 25 cents, the same price that they paid to see the Igorots, to come and see these babies in their incubators. And Cooney's story, it also touches on fake news in a different way, not for political reasons, but I think there's a very interesting lesson there about newspaper coverage of him was marked by a similar lack of fact-checking and also by sensationalism. Journalists, for example, regularly exaggerated the size of the babies, so that Cooney said babies born under 2 pounds don't have much chance of survival, whereas many of the journalists reported on how babies had been brought in who weighed less than 1 pound. Now, back then it wasn't possible that these babies would survive. So these babies were being brought in. In one newspaper I read, there was a reference to a baby being smaller than an apple, which again, just these stories were pure fabrication to entertain readers, to sell newspapers. Another interesting aspect about Cooney's story is that key aspects of his life story were invented, most likely by Cooney himself. But what's interesting about that is that this is a fact which has been missed by journalists right up to the present day. There was a marked lack of fact-checking. So at the beginning of Cooney's career, he's viewed with a kind of healthy skepticism by newspaper journalists. He, by some, is presented as exploiting the babies, as a mercenary, just in it for the money. By the end of his 50-year career, he's being presented by those same newspapers as a hero. He's credited with saving 6,500 babies who would otherwise have been left to die. I think undoubtedly he did save thousands of babies. Whether it's as high as 6,500 is up for debate. And newspapers they went over the top praising him. And I discovered through my own archival research into Cooney that he'd invented much of his past, including his qualifications. He didn't have a medical degree, and he didn't have a license to practice medicine in America. If this had been discovered, not only would his livelihood have been threatened, he most likely would have been sent to jail. I should point out that he had a big staff, so he did actually employ 2 medical doctors and a team of nurses who were qualified. So the babies were receiving very good care, but he wasn't the man he presented himself as. Now, hundreds of articles were written about Cooney in his lifetime. He died in 1950. There have been many, many, many articles written about him since. He has a kind of legendary status, and people have vague ideas of him, and they vaguely know about his story. Almost everybody who does know his story will tell you he's a doctor. And this is down to journalists who, for more than a century, have been describing him as a doctor. He was a man for whom social status was very important. Now, in 1939, a very respected journalist called A.J. Liebling wrote a big article for The New Yorker called The Patron of the Preemies. And at a conservative estimate, that article contains 14 important inaccuracies. His age, his place of birth, his qualifications, his professional experience, all of these are wrong in that article. As recently as 2015, the New York Times wrote an article about Cooney. Now, New York Times obviously also prides itself, like the New Yorker, on rigorous fact-checking. It wrongly described Cooney as a doctor and inaccurately reported his professional experience. Now, I think that's very important that that's being reported in 2015. By then, it would be very easy for a journalist to go back and check out Cooney's story and just to check that the basics of that story are correct, just as I was able to do. I think probably there's a point that by this point in Cooney's career, his story's been told so many times, it's been in so many newspapers, so many magazines, so many TV and radio outlets, as well as online, that there's an assumption on the part of the journalist that this is a true story and that these basic facts of his life are accurate. And I think this shows us as journalists and as consumers of the news just how important it is always to go back to basics, to check the truth of everything we report, everything we read, and that's especially true just now when we have so much fake news around. And I think what was true in both the story of Martin Cooney and that of the Igorots was that in reading the press coverage, you couldn't take anything at face value. You always had to read with a degree of skepticism. And these are obviously examples from history, but examples which have great relevance today that remind us the importance of being skeptical, of questioning things. And I think also it shows us that there was no golden age of American journalism from which we've fallen. The same is true of many other countries. Often this is presented as the nadir of the media, with numerous websites and publications churning out stories which have been deliberately distorted or made up for political or financial ends, where in fact in America journalists, as in many other countries, have a long history of falsification. And American proprietors, like those in the UK and in many other countries, have a long history of publishing accounts which are politically biased. So yes, in short, to sum up, there is nothing new about fake news. Don't know if anyone has any questions.
Isn't it the velocity with which fake news propagates that's the problem now?
Yeah. I don't know if we've got a microphone coming. Yeah.
I'm just saying that fake news isn't anything new, but I mean, I've even heard claims that a lot of cave paintings from ancient times are actually fake. But isn't it the problem with the velocity with which it circulates? In the times you're talking about, it circulates a lot more slowly.
I think you have a very good point. I think back then it was interesting that the same fake news as it does today, it kind of gathered steam and was reported over and over and over again. But yes, I think you're right. I think there's part of this kind of 24/7 media culture that we live in, that stories are picked up very quickly, and before you know it, it's gone viral. So yes, I think that's true, and also we're bombarded all the time. There's so much media that is a huge problem, and I think it underlines the importance of going to sources that we trust. So for me, the BBC is a source I trust. I know that a lot of what I'm going to read there is going to be reliable. Yes, velocity is an issue. And I don't know what the solution to that is. I think stories get picked up and spun, and kind of gather a momentum of their own, and we'll maybe go from a source that isn't legitimate to being picked up by more legitimate sources and not necessarily checked. Yeah. Sometimes I feel that would be a good idea, yeah. Do we have any others?
Thank you for your interesting presentation. I couldn't escape the feeling that the reader is as much responsible than the news feeder for accepting and making those fake news real. What do you think is really inside a certain news that make it more believable than other? Is it the entertaining value of the news, the horror that comes with it, the fact that contradicts assumed principles?
So sorry, what's the difference in different readers or in different media?
The news that makes them popular, even if they are fake.
Even if it's obviously fake, why do people want to read it? Yeah, I think a lot of it is down to entertainment, and I think also we live in an age where people tend to, obviously the way news is consumed is different, so people have lots of different channels, lots of people now will rely entirely on social media for fake news, and I think there's this kind of, people seek out the news that agrees with their political viewpoint, and then there's always been an element of that, but I think that's become more of an issue. So the Trump election being a classic example of that, Brexit being another, where people were reading the kind of news they wanted, or news that they wanted to consume, and not necessarily reading it with clearly not reading it with a healthy skepticism.
So the reader influences the news more than the news influences.
I think the reader is guilty. Anyone else? Oh, no, is that us? Okay. We're done? Okay. Well, thank you.